Hello everyone, my name is Rachel. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am bringing you guys a video that I briefly mentioned in a video that I filmed last week, which was the anti-TBR tag. That will of course be linked up in the cards above if you are interested in that. But that is just a video where I discuss books and authors that I will never read from, and I explain my reasons why. And one of the questions on that tag was series that you started that you don't plan on finishing, and I just had so many to talk about that I decided to do a completely separate video about it. So I'm not going to really go into the plots of these series just because I'd rather discuss with you guys the reasons why I'm not continuing on as opposed to just what the series are about, if that makes sense. So this is going to be kind of random. This definitely spans a lot of different genres, YA, adult, things like that. So without further ado, let's just get into it. The first series that popped into my mind when I came up with this video idea was Kingdom of the Wicked by Kerri Maniscalco. So I read the first book of the series, which is Kingdom of the Wicked, sometime last year, and I enjoyed it. I did end up giving it 4 stars. I thought it was a very interesting kind of world and plot because this takes place in Sicily, and I want to say the 1700s, and it's about like these 2 twin sisters that are witches, and one of them gets murdered like right at the beginning of the book, and so the plot goes on from there. My main problem with this book is that it was so tropey, and it is a YA fantasy book, and it was just so like 2012 YA fantasy that I was rolling my eyes while reading this. Like, I'm just gonna read you the tropes that I noticed in this book. From the gorgeous dark-haired love interest who may or may not be evil, to the reckless main character who keeps getting themselves into trouble. Yeah, it did feel like Kerri Maniscalco was almost trying to fill like a YA fantasy trope bingo card. It was just over the top for me. I usually don't mind tropes being used over and over again, but for some reason it kind of annoyed me in this case. I will say the ending was decent. There's like a decent little cliffhanger going on, but there was just nothing that is attracting me to pick up the second book. Kerri Maniscalco is another author that I don't think I'm ever gonna pick up her books again, just because I've also read her entire Stalking Jack the Ripper series, and that ended up being pretty meh for me as well. So clearly she's just not the author for me, and that's okay. Next is a series that I think you guys might attack me for DNFing, and that is the Ember and the Ashes series by Sabaa Tahir. Let me start this by saying that I was so excited going into this series, and I did read the first 3 books in this series, which is Ember and the Ashes, Torch Against the Night, and Reaper at the Gates, and then the 4th and final book came out this past December. I don't know, man, for me this series just did not live up to the hype. Everybody was talking about how amazing these books are and the world and the characters, and like, I agree that the world's interesting and the fantastical elements are interesting as well, and it does offer something different to the YA fantasy genre, but for me personally, I never fully emotionally connected to the main characters, mainly Elias and Laia. They do end up having a romance throughout the series. I also just found that to be unbelievable because when you think about it, these 2 characters actually don't spend all that much time in the same area. A lot of the series, they're separated, and so I didn't really understand like how they could love each other so much. Next up is The Inheritance Games by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. So this is a YA contemporary mystery series. It also has kind of a Cinderella element to it, and I think there was a love square. There was definitely a love triangle, because basically this girl Avery, she ends up inheriting this man's entire estate, and so she goes to live at this house, but his family is already living there, and so she ends up forming really interesting relationships with his 3 grandsons, or 3 or 4 grandsons, I don't know, and I think there's inklings of a romance with all of them, so there's just a lot going on. This was entertaining enough. I gave it 4 stars, and I thought the ending was good. I think there's a little bit of a cliffhanger, but it wasn't nearly enough for me to want to continue on with this series. I mean, I would recommend checking it out for yourself if the plot appeals to you. But I don't know, I think this too ended up becoming a little too YA for my taste. Next is A Deadly Education by Naomi Novik. So this is book 1 in her Scholomance series. I don't know when the second book is coming out, but I read this sometime last year. And what I will say about this book is that it's a very interesting world. Essentially it takes place at this magical school that is like Hogwarts from hell, basically. There's no teachers, and there's all of these like dangerous monsters and creatures that basically live inside the school. And so students can't really ever be by themselves, or else they'll get attacked by these monsters. I found myself confused a lot of the time as to what the hell was actually going on, and I think part of that is Naomi Novik's writing. I do remember feeling very overwhelmed by the world building and just not understanding it in general. I thought that the characters were interesting. I liked the main character. I do remember that this book also has a little bit of controversy surrounding it. I can't remember the specifics of that, but I'm actually gonna link a video that Read with Cindy, I think that's her channel name, but Cindy made. I'll probably link that up in the cards above, where she talked about the controversy surrounding this book, and just kind of talked about white authors writing characters of color in general. So I do think that that video is very interesting, and that'll definitely educate you about what's going on with this book. But yeah, the ending was also like a solid cliffhanger, but it just did not motivate me to pick up the next book. Next up is You by Carolyn Kapnis. This is a series that I didn't even know was a series when I read You a couple of years ago. But now I think there's 3 books in the series, and I just have not heard good things about the subsequent books. You, I really enjoyed. I think I almost gave it 5 stars. The audiobook in particular is amazing. This is a mystery thriller series, and the main character is the villain. He's like this psychopath. And I loved the first book, but yeah, just hearing the way that people talk about the sequels, I just do not care about picking them up. Next up is a series that I just don't think needs to be a series, and that is Beartown by Frederick Bachman. So I read Beartown in early 2019. I really enjoyed it for the most part. I gave it 4 stars. It centers around this town that is obsessed with hockey, and huge content warning, there is a rape scene like 30 to 40% into this book. While I did enjoy this book for the most part, because we do follow a lot of different characters and we really get a good sense of the town and how it works, the whole rape scene and how it completely changed the direction of the story, I don't know, I just found it hard to understand why Bachman wrote the story the way he did. And so I did read the sequel, which is Us Against You. I ended up giving that 2 stars. And honestly, that was my mistake of even reading it in the first place, because in my mind, Beartown is its own story. There's an epilogue at the end of Beartown where it skips 10 years. We see all of the main characters and what they've been doing with their lives 10 years later. Then Us Against You picks up right where the present day timeline of Beartown ended. And I just found that weird, because I just thought Beartown wrapped up in a neat little bow, and then, you know, we're continuing on the story. He also added a lot of new characters. Things got very confusing for me very quickly, and I also wonder if that's because I listened to the audiobook while I was driving, and maybe I should have read it physically. I'm not really sure, but at the same time, like, the plot of Us Against You really didn't appeal to me. And then there is a 3rd book that he is coming out with at some point this year. Yeah, needless to say, I will not be picking up that 3rd book. And yeah, honestly, I'm not even motivated to pick up any more Frederick Bachman's because of my experience reading the sequel to Beartown. Next up is The Hazelwood by Melissa Albert. So I read the first book a couple of months ago. You know, I liked it well enough. I think I did give it 4 stars. It definitely has a very interesting, darker fantasy world to it. Definitely one of the darker YA fantasies that I've ever read. But again, it's just, I think the way that this ended was, it might have been kind of a neat little bow. I don't remember there being too much of a cliffhanger, but even if there was, it just wasn't anything that interested me in picking up the next books. I think there's a sequel, and then I think there's just like a novella bind up. Then the next series I want to bring up is These Broken Stars. This is by Megan Spooner and Amy Kaufman. I actually read this first book pretty recently, like last week. And this is a YA sci-fi thriller trilogy. It was pitched to me as, if you liked the Illuminae files, you would really enjoy this, especially if you love romance, because this trilogy focuses more on the romance than Illuminae files. And this book ended up just being fine for me. I gave it 3 stars. I thought that the world and the concept was very interesting, but everything else, literally everything else, was just very lackluster for me. And even though the 2 subsequent books center around different main characters, I still just have no interest in picking it up because I really just wasn't impressed by Amy Kaufman and Megan Spooner's writing in this first book. All right, so next we're gonna get into some series that I actually own physical copies of the first books. First up is The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. I actually have an entire reading vlog dedicated to my experience reading this book. It was my first reading vlog ever in early 2019. That'll be linked up in the cards above. You can tell in that vlog that I fully expected to love this book and give it 5 stars, which was why I did a reading vlog for it, because I thought that I was just going to rave and rave about what I love about this book, and unfortunately that wasn't the case. I ended up giving it 3 stars. The Hulu television series is way better in my opinion than this book. You can watch that reading vlog to get all the details about why this didn't really work for me. But Margaret Atwood recently, maybe in 2019, maybe 2020, came out with The Testament, which is a sequel to this book. While I am a little intrigued to see what direction that story goes in, I have also heard from a lot of people that it's just not a great book. Like, I haven't seen anyone that I follow on Goodreads give it 5 stars. Next up is The Devouring Gray by Christine Lynn Herman. This is book 1 in a duology by her, and this is one of those YA fantasies that totally gives me vibes of Riverdale and Stranger Things. You know, I definitely didn't hate this book. I remember listening to it while I was driving, and I think it's a solid YA paranormal kind of fantasy story. Definitely great for like the Halloween time of year. It definitely gives those vibes. However, it just wasn't anything that, again, like motivated me to want to pick up the second book. Next up we have Bring Me Their Hearts by Sarah Wolfe. So this is book 1 in a trilogy, a YA fantasy trilogy, and I actually really enjoyed this first book. I gave it 4 stars. This is one of those tropes, one of my favorites, where one of the main characters is sent to kill the love interest, but they end up falling in love instead. Don't we all love that? So this one was really good. But I read the sequel, which is Find Me Their Bones, and I gave it 2 stars. I was just bored and I was confused. I didn't really understand what was going on in that second book. So I just have no interest in ever picking up the third book, even though I did get an e-arc of it off of NetGalley. Yeah, the direction that second book went in, man, it just, I don't know, it just didn't work. And I did also feel myself getting annoyed by the romance in the second book. I loved the way everything played out in this one, but yeah, in the second book, she took it in a different direction that I just thought was odd. Next up, we have Red Rising by Pierce Brown. This is a pretty recent DNF for me. I read the first book, Red Rising, in January, gave it 4 stars. That might have been a little bit generous of a rating, mainly because I struggled so much with Pierce Brown's writing, especially going into the second book, Golden Sun. I DNF'd that book at page 50. That's how much I was struggling with the writing. This one, I guess it was a little bit easier for me to get into the writing. I just feel like Pierce Brown struggles with writing descriptions in general. Like, it was hard for me to get a clear picture of what things looked like and what actually was going on. Also, like battle scenes, I found it hard to follow what was actually happening as well. So yes, while the concept and the world and the plot is very interesting for me, I almost wish that like a different author would have written it, because I think that I would have enjoyed it more. And last but certainly not least, we have Girls of Paper and Fire by Natasha and Jan. So this is a series, I don't know how many books she's planning on writing in it, but I loved this first book, Girls of Paper and Fire. I think it's a fantastic YA fantasy. I think it does bring something very unique to the genre. However, you know, this book kind of ends on a cliffhanger, but I also think that things wrapped up really well, and it is its own individual story in a way. I read the synopsis for the second book, which I think is Girls of Storm and Shadow, something like that. And the plot goes in a very different direction. It turns into like a journey quest kind of story, and that just does not interest me at all. I've also seen numerous reviews from people that loved this book just as much as I did, saying that that second book was very lackluster. So yeah, it's not a series that I'm ever going to continue with. However, I definitely want to reread this first book at some point, because I really think that it's something really great in the YA fantasy genre. All right, guys, that's going to be it for book series that I never plan on finishing. I would love it if you would leave a comment down below telling me about some of the book series that you started and DNF'd as well. I would also love it if you would leave a like and subscribe, and I thank you in advance if you do. And with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!